The chandeliers at the Sovereign Nashville did not just illuminate the grand ballroom, they declared it. 4,000 crystals arranged across 3 enormous fixtures, casting the kind of amber light that costs $20 a watt and makes everyone inside believe they belong. On the evening of October 3rd, the Riverside Ballroom on the hotel's 14th floor held 231 guests, each one in formal wear, each one aware of what the evening was supposed to represent. Pierce Resorts was announcing its national expansion, a 5-year plan to build 11 luxury wellness resorts across the American West, backed by an anchor investment that had been kept strictly confidential for 6 months. Tonight was the announcement. Tonight was when the money became official. Nobody in that room knew who was coming. Nobody, that is, except Gerald Pierce. And Gerald Pierce was on the 12th floor, taking the most important phone call of his career. When the evening started to go sideways, Chris Hemsworth walked through the main entrance of the Sovereign Nashville at 6:04 p.m. in worn leather work boots, faded dark jeans, and a plain navy cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. He was 6 feet 3 inches of quietly assembled presence, the kind of man who occupied space without announcing it, the way a large tree occupies a field. He had been in Nashville for 2 days, staying under a different name at a mid-range hotel on the east side of town, because he had learned a long time ago that the best way to know whether something was real was to arrive before anyone had prepared a version of it for you. He had no security with him, no assistant, just a worn leather notebook in his back pocket and the particular stillness of someone who had grown up in places where the land was bigger than any human concern. He had asked Gerald Pierce for one thing: let me walk the venue before the guests arrive. Gerald had agreed without hesitating. This was how Chris worked. Always had been. The ballroom setup crew was still finishing the final touches. A young woman in a black event uniform was adjusting the arrangement on a VIP table near the east wall, and she looked up when he walked in with the natural instinct of someone who had learned to read rooms fast. "Can I help you find someone?" she asked, not suspicious, just attentive. "Not yet," Chris said. "I'm early. Mind if I just walk through? Go ahead." She went back to the table, then paused. "Water? The bar won't open until 7, but I can get you something from the kitchen." "That'd be great. Thank you." Her name tag read Aline. She was maybe 23, with the particular competence of someone doing a job well without needing anyone to notice. She brought him a glass of water without fuss and went back to what she was doing. He walked the room slowly. At the far end, a 4-person AV crew was running the evening's sound setup, positioning a wireless microphone on the main podium. Chris paused beside the monitor bank for a moment, listening. One of the technicians looked up. "Everything all right?" "The left monitor," Chris said, nodding toward the nearest speaker column. "You've got it angled about 8 inches too far inward relative to the podium position. When someone's speaking at full projection, you'll get a feedback loop in the upper register." The technician looked at him, then at the monitor, then back at him. "You work in sound?" "Not professionally, but I've sat in enough rooms." He moved on. The technician adjusted the monitor skeptically and ran a tone test. He made a note in his tablet. The correction worked. Chris reached the catering table near the entrance and stopped. He picked up the printed evening menu, a 4-page document, heavy stock, gold lettering, and skimmed it with the particular speed of someone reading to find something specific rather than absorb everything. He stopped on the 3rd appetizer. He looked at Aaliyah across the room. "The wild mushroom bruschetta," he said. "The ingredient list doesn't mention pine nuts. Are they in the recipe?" She came over and took the menu. "Read the line." "Read it again." "I'll check with the kitchen," she said quietly. She came back 3 minutes later. "You're right, they're in there. I'll have them fix the labels before service." He nodded and handed the menu back. "Someone's got a tree nut allergy in the room tonight," he said. "Probably more than one." She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating a category. Then she went to fix the problem. He moved on through the room. Near the main entrance, one of the floral installation crew was struggling with a large arrangement that kept tipping slightly off balance on its base. Chris stopped, looked at it for a moment, then reached out and shifted the base 2 inches to the left, redistributing the weight without asking. The crew member looked up, started to say something, then looked at the arrangement. It was perfectly balanced. "Center of gravity was off," Chris said. and moved on. The crew member watched him go the same way the sound technician had watched him go, with the expression of someone who had just been shown something by a person they couldn't quite place. But here is where the evening changed. Here is the part no one had planned for. Madison Pierce arrived at the ballroom at 6:22 p.m. in the full velocity of a person who had been managing 11 simultaneous crises since 7 that morning. She was 32, VP of Brand and Events at Pierce Resorts, and she ran the company's public presence the way a conductor runs an orchestra, by making everyone aware, at all times, of exactly how much was at stake and who was responsible for delivering it. She had built tonight's event from a blank calendar page over 3 months. Every floral arrangement, every sound cue, every seat assignment. She was extraordinarily good at this. She was also in the particular fashion of someone who has learned to manage stress by converting it into authority, not entirely good at the spaces between the planning. She moved through the ballroom, checking things off her clipboard, speaking to staff in bursts of precise instruction, and she noticed Chris Hemsworth standing near the catering table with the menu in his hands. She didn't know who he was. The name Chris Hemsworth existed in her mental database in exactly one category: actor. She had not been told he was coming. She had not been told anything about the anchor investor's identity. That had been Gerald's decision. Keep it absolutely confidential. Reveal at the event. Madison had agreed without pressing for details because she had 40 other things to press for. What she saw was a very tall man in work boots standing near a restricted catering setup without a formal identification badge before guest arrival had officially begun. She crossed the room. "Sir, vendor access is through the south loading dock. This area is restricted until 7. Chris looked up from the menu. "I think I'm in the right place. I was asked to arrive at 6. "You're welcome to wait in the vendor staging area on the 2nd floor," she said, already looking past him at her clipboard. "The dock entrance is around the back. Security can show you." "I'm not a vendor," he said. Something in his voice, the quiet certainty of it, the absence of agitation, made her look at him more directly for a moment. He was very calm, tall, broad, clearly fit, wearing what her practiced eye clocked as old work clothes. She registered these facts and drew the conclusion that her schedule and her stress level and her experience of events suggested. "Are you with one of the catering companies?" she asked. "No." "Are you press?" "No." "Then you'll need to speak to our front desk about your invitation, because I don't see you on any of my access lists, and I really don't have time right now." She was already moving. "South loading dock. Security will sort it out." She was gone before he could finish the sentence he had started. He stood there for a moment. Then he went back to reading the menu. But here is what you need to understand. This was not yet the thing that broke the evening. This was just the overture. By 7:30, the ballroom was filling. 200 guests in formal wear, champagne moving on silver trays, the string quartet doing what string quartets do at these events, playing something that signaled refinement without requiring anyone to actually listen. The air smelled of $100,000 worth of floral arrangements and whatever the kitchen was finishing below. The energy in the room was the particular energy of wealthy people at an event they have been told is important. Conversations about deals and properties and market positions. The careful social calculus of who was standing near whom. People who had come for the announcement, for the investment presentation, for the numbers, and people who had come because being seen at the right events was, itself, a kind of currency. Chris was near the east side of the room, talking quietly with Aaliyah, who had finished her setup duties and was working the floor. He had learned her name was Aaliyah Davidson, that she was working her way through a hospitality management degree at Belmont University, that she had been doing events work since 19 because her tuition didn't pay itself. She was telling him about a dinner she had managed the previous spring that had gone sideways when the catering truck had the wrong address, and 200 guests had waited 40 minutes with nothing but water. "What did you do?" he asked. "I ordered 40 pizzas from 3 different places and had them delivered in unmarked boxes. Nobody was certain if it was planned or not." He laughed. A real laugh, the kind that arrives without permission. Aaliyah was surprised by it. Not because it was unexpected, but because it landed differently than the laughs of most people she served at events like this. It didn't have anything to prove. That was when Madison Pierce noticed him again. She had spent the past hour managing final guest arrivals, and she had, in the space between tasks, remembered the conversation near the catering table and become increasingly certain that the tall man in work boots was still somewhere in her event without proper credentials. She had asked a security guard to locate him. The guard had reported back, east wall, talking to one of the waitstaff. Madison crossed the room with the focused directness of someone who has already decided how a situation ends. "You're still here." She said it loud enough that the couple at the nearest table turned to look. Chris turned. He was unhurried about it. "I told you," she said, and her voice had found the register she used when she needed rooms to understand she was serious. "This area requires proper credentialing. You are not on any guest list, you are not on any vendor list, and you are now standing in the middle of a 200-person event that I have been building for 3 months." She looked at him. The jeans, the old work boots, the rolled cotton sleeves. "I don't know how you got through the main entrance, but you need to come with security right now." "I came in because someone invited me," Chris said. "Then let's find that person together," she said, in the tone she used when she had no intention of doing that. "Security will assist you at the south exit. I'd prefer you contact Gerald Pierce directly," he said, the same even, unhurried voice. "He knows I'm here. I came through the main entrance," Chris said. "Someone let me in, and that someone made an error." She raised her voice slightly, not quite projecting to the room, but close. "Enough. People in this room paid $25,000 for tables at this event. I will not have the standards of this evening compromised." A few people nearby had stopped their conversations. Phones began appearing. "I'd prefer you contact Gerald Pierce," Chris said, the same even, unperturbed voice. "He knows I'm here. Gerald Pierce is in a meeting and cannot be interrupted for." She stopped herself, looked at him. "What's your name?" he told her. She stared at him. Something happened behind her eyes, a calculation running that returned an error. Chris Hemsworth. She knew that name. She was absolutely certain she knew that name. And she was absolutely certain that the man standing in front of her, in old boots and a cotton shirt, could not be that person. He looked nothing like what she had constructed from magazine photos and film posters. He was simply too ordinary, too quiet, too present in the wrong way. "That's not possible," she said, and she said it with conviction. "I understand why you'd think that," he said. He said it without sarcasm, and she made her decision. Perhaps she was tired. Perhaps 3 months of pressure had narrowed the space between assumption and action. Perhaps she simply could not rebuild her entire understanding of the evening in the span of 10 seconds standing in front of a man in worn jeans. She turned toward the room, and she did the thing she should not have done. She walked to the podium at the front of the ballroom, and she picked up the wireless microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to take just a moment to assure you all that our security team has everything under control this evening." Her voice was clear and projected across 200 people. "We had a small credentialing issue earlier, and I want you to feel completely confident that." She nodded toward the 2 security guards near the east wall. They moved toward Chris. The ballroom went quiet in the way that expensive rooms go quiet. Not all at once, but in widening circles. Conversations dying outward from the center like rings from a stone dropped in still water. 200 people watched Chris Hemsworth set his water glass down on the nearest table with the particular deliberateness of someone making a choice about how this moment would go. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He had grown up in a place where losing your temper cost you in ways that took months to recover from. He had learned, in that place, that the man who waits longest usually wins. He allowed the 2 security guards to walk him toward the service corridor. Several people had their phones out. A woman near the second row was recording. A man in a gray suit near the bar looked uncomfortable and looked away. A few guests at the tables nearest the east wall were watching with the specific quality of attention that appears when people understand they are witnessing something they will be describing to other people later. Aaliyah Davidson stood near the bar with her hands completely still at her sides. She had known, from the allergen correction and the monitor adjustment and the way he had listened more than he spoke, that this man was not who the room was treating him as. She did not move. She had learned in 3 years of events work that the rooms she was paid to be invisible in were also the rooms where speaking cost you things you couldn't easily replace. She understood this as one of the most uncomfortable truths of the work. She watched him go. This moment, her silence and the quality of her stillness, was something Chris Hemsworth would not forget. In the service corridor, Chris took out his phone. He typed one message to Rebecca Shore, his assistant. "On my way out. Get Gerald now." Rebecca Shore had been with him for 4 years. She sent back one word: running. He put his phone away and stood with his back against the corridor wall. And for a moment, he was simply a man from Melbourne who had traveled a very long way from where he had started. He had been working since he was 13. Kitchen hand at a place in St. Kilda that didn't ask too many questions. Construction site labor in the summers when school was out. Lifeguard shifts that started before the sun came up. Because the morning shifts paid better, and you learned early that the hours other people didn't want were the ones available to you. His family had spent time in Bullman in the Northern Territory when he was young. Red dust country, cattle stations, mornings so wide and silent they could make a boy understand what small actually meant. He had learned out there that the land had no opinion about who you were, that it would test you the same whether you showed up confident or uncertain, and that the only thing it rewarded was being genuinely present. He had learned to box because the territory taught you to be ready. He had learned to surf when the family moved back to the coast because the ocean is the most effective cure ever devised for believing you are important. He had built a company, and then another company, and then an investment portfolio, and none of it had changed that fact that he was most comfortable in old clothes, in a room where no one knew his name, because that was the version of himself that had been there first. He carried one physical reminder of all of it, a faint scar along his left palm from a construction nail he had caught wrong at 16, working a demolition job in Fitzroy that had paid him $30 a day. He noticed it sometimes when he signed documents. He had never had it removed. Tonight, standing outside a 5-star hotel in Nashville, that was the version of himself that was present. The one that knew what it felt like to be categorized and dismissed before you had finished a sentence. The one that had always known what rooms like that cost the people who moved through them invisibly. On the 12th floor, Gerald Pierce ended his call mid-sentence when his assistant opened the suite door with a face that told him everything. He was in the elevator 45 seconds later. His assistant briefed him in the descent. 230 guests, microphone announcement, walked out the service door. Gerald Pierce had been in business for 47 years. He had closed deals in rooms where people were actively hostile to him and emerged with the better agreement. He had built Pierce Resorts from a single property in Scottsdale into a brand with 9 locations and 11 more planned. He was, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinarily composed man. He was not composed on the walk from the elevator to the service corridor. He found Chris standing outside the hotel's south exit, leaning against the wall in the early October Nashville evening, looking at his phone. "Chris," Gerald arrived breathing harder than he intended to. "I need you to know this was a complete misunderstanding. Madison doesn't know who you are. She was managing the event. Gerald." Chris looked up. "I'm not angry." The thing about Chris Hemsworth was that this was true. He was not angry. He had been dismissed before. He had been underestimated before. He had spent enough of his life in rooms where people looked at his clothes rather than his face to know that the anger it produced was expensive and ultimately pointless. What he felt, standing outside in the Nashville air, was something quieter and more particular. He felt the weight of what had just been confirmed. Gerald exhaled slowly. "Let me take you back in through the private entrance. I'll make the announcement. Will." "Gerald, before we do that, I need to know one thing." "Of course, anything. Does she run the company?" Gerald was quiet for a moment. "She's VP of Brand and Events." "That's not what I asked." Gerald looked at the contract pages in his breast pocket. He had been carrying them there all evening, waiting to sign them at the announcement. He could feel them now, folded once. Heavy stock paper, 3 signatures missing. "She has significant operational influence," he said carefully. "But no, she doesn't run the company, I do." Chris nodded slowly. He pushed off the wall. "All right," he said. "Let's go back in." This was the fake resolution. Gerald Pierce thought the hard part was over. He exhaled, actually, audibly exhaled, and took Chris back inside through the private executive entrance on the north side of the building. He positioned him quietly at the head VIP table and patted his shoulder once and began moving toward the stage, his face already arranging itself into the expression of a man about to deliver good news. He thought the evening had been saved. But Madison Pierce, watching from the other side of the room, did not know what her father was doing. She had no idea who the man in the boots was. All she registered was her father escorting the same individual she had just had removed, in front of 200 people, on a microphone, back through a private entrance and placing him at the most important table in the room. All she felt was the specific, destabilizing sensation of her own authority being publicly reversed. She picked up the microphone before her father was halfway to the stage. She said the words about unauthorized reversals and the standards of Pierce Resorts, her voice controlled and precise and entirely catastrophically wrong. Gerald Pierce froze in the center of the ballroom. Derek Walsh, at the edge of the room, looked at the empty space where his courage had been for 22 minutes. He looked at the man being addressed as a problem. He looked at his own hands. He crossed the room. He took the microphone, Madison. The voice came from the edge of the room. He stood in front of 230 people and said, "That man is the reason this event exists." The room went entirely still. He had prepared no speech. He said what was true in the sequence it was true. He explained who Chris Hemsworth was, not the actor, though several guests had already begun looking at each other with the particular expression of people rapidly rebuilding a mental picture, but the investor. The $340 million anchor commitment to Pierce Resorts' wellness expansion, negotiated over 18 months, kept confidential as a condition of Chris's involvement, the commitment that had made 3 other major institutional investors comfortable enough to follow. The commitment that represented, by Derek's careful and public accounting, 68% of the total capital behind the 5-year plan that Gerald Pierce had been about to announce from this very stage. He paused. Then he said something else. He said this was not the first time. He mentioned a name the room recognized, James Briggs, who had been Pierce Resorts' catering coordinator until 8 months ago, when he had questioned a venue decision in front of a client and been walked out of the building the same afternoon. He mentioned a second name, Dana Harwell, logistics manager, let go 6 months before that, after she had copied the wrong people on an email containing feedback that had not been approved. Both of them had been described, in their termination paperwork, as not aligned with company culture. Both of them had been doing exactly what their jobs required. Derek said he had known about both. He had said nothing. Then he said the last thing. He said he had known for 22 minutes. He had been standing at the edge of this room for 22 minutes, watching a man who had committed $340 million to this company be walked out through a service corridor, and he had not spoken. He said this because he had spent enough of his career not saying things, and he had just watched what silence looked like from the outside, and he was done with that version of himself. He set the microphone down on the podium. He took a step back. The room processed what it had just heard for approximately 4 seconds. Then it erupted. Not the polite, managed noise of a wealthy event running on schedule. Something messier and more genuine. 200 people recalibrating simultaneously. The sound of certainty becoming uncertainty, becoming something unresolved. Half a dozen conversations started at once. A woman near the front table put her champagne flute down very deliberately. A man in a gray suit was already typing on his phone. 3 people near the entrance were looking at each other with the particular expression that appears when someone realizes they were watching something important without understanding it. Madison Pierce stood at the front of the room with the microphone on the podium in front of her and nowhere to put her hands. She looked at Derek. She looked at her father, standing frozen in the center of the ballroom. She looked at the man sitting calmly at the VIP table, the man she had described, in front of 200 people, as a credentialing issue. She looked at the room looking at her. Her father's face was the worst part. Gerald Pierce was a man who had survived 47 years in business by never letting a room see what he was thinking. He was letting it now. The unsigned contract in his breast pocket, she could see the corner of it, seemed in this moment to weigh more than everything else in the room combined. Chris stood up slowly from the VIP table. The room was still processing. He looked at Gerald across the ballroom and he said, at a volume that carried clearly through the noise, "Gerald, I came here to do business. I'm still prepared to do that. But you and I should talk tonight before anything gets signed. Gerald Pierce nodded. He nodded the way a man nods when he understands that the conversation he is about to have will cost him something, and he is not yet certain how much. The consequences of the evening at the Sovereign Nashville ran in the sequence that consequences usually run, from the nearest person outward, like rings from a stone dropped into still water. Madison Pierce was removed from her VP of Brand and Events role at Pierce Resorts within 72 hours of the gala. The Pierce Resorts board of 3 members held an emergency call the following morning and agreed, in under 40 minutes, that the position had become untenable. The formal written reasons cited demonstrated failure of judgment in a material stakeholder engagement resulting in the placement of $340 million in committed investment capital at immediate and unnecessary risk. Gerald Pierce, her father, did not vote for her removal. He abstained, which was, in its own way, a vote. The $340 million investment was placed under formal review by Chris's management team on the Monday following the gala. 3 of Pierce Resorts' secondary investors requested clarification calls within 48 hours of the event footage circulating on social media. The brand's planned national announcement, timed to coincide with the gala, was delayed by 6 weeks while the partnership structure was renegotiated, at terms significantly less favorable to Pierce Resorts than the original agreement. A piece in the Nashville Business Journal ran the following Tuesday with the headline, "How Pierce Resorts Lost Its Anchor in One Evening." It was picked up by 3 major financial publications by Thursday afternoon. By Friday, the story had been shared widely enough that it no longer required seeking out. Derek Walsh appeared before the Pierce Resorts board in a formal review meeting 2 weeks later. He retained his role, narrowly. He told Chris directly, in a brief private conversation afterward, that he was sorry for the 22 minutes. Chris told him he understood how fear worked and that choosing to speak, even late, was the thing that mattered. He meant it. Madison Pierce's moment of reckoning did not come in a boardroom or on a phone call with lawyers. It came 3 weeks after the gala, on a Tuesday afternoon, when she was alone in her former office collecting the last of her things. Her assistant had left a printed message on the desk, a call request from a journalist asking for her comment on the incident. She looked at the message for a long time. She thought about the 11 different PR responses her team had drafted in the first 48 hours after the video circulated. Each one carefully worded, each one technically accurate, each one designed to make the story about a simple misunderstanding rather than about what it had actually been. She had not released any of them. Not because she had suddenly become noble, but because she understood, somewhere below the level where lawyers operated, that none of those statements would say what needed saying. She picked up instead the printed program from the gala, the one she had designed and proofread herself, down to the font kerning on the header. She turned to the keynote speaker page. The line where the name should have been was blank. It had been intentionally blank. A surprise reveal, her father's idea that she had signed off on without asking why. She had printed 230 copies of an event program with a blank line where the most important name of the evening was supposed to go. And she had seen it every day for 6 weeks during production, and she had never asked who that person was going to be. She sat with the program in her hands in the empty office for a long time. She had seen a tall man in worn clothes and made a judgment about who he was before he had finished a sentence. She had performed that judgment publicly, into a microphone, in front of 200 people, with the absolute certainty of someone who had categorized 1,000 people at 1,000 events and had never once, until now, been forced to examine the machinery behind the categories. She understood, sitting alone in the room, that this machinery had not been installed at that gala. It had been running for years. It had moved quietly through every event she had ever managed, every vendor she had ever waved toward the service entrance, every person she had assessed in 3 seconds based on what they were wearing and what kind of accent they carried. She had never noticed it because it had never cost her anything before. That was the cost of being right about things often enough. You never develop the habit of checking whether the method that generates your certainty is actually sound. She set the program down on the empty desk. She did not fill in the blank line. There was nothing left to write there. But she did not throw the program away. She kept it. She took it home and put it in a drawer The way people keep the specific objects that serve as accurate records of who they were at a particular moment. Not to be proud of, but not to be forgotten either. 3 months later, the renegotiated investment agreement between Chris Hemsworth's management entity and Pierce Resorts was finalized at $180 million, reduced tit from the original $340 million, restructured with 3 new governance requirements attached as conditions of closing. One of those conditions was unusual enough that 2 of Pierce Resorts' lawyers had flagged it for clarification. It was a clause requiring that 2% of the brand's first-year operating budget be allocated to a staff development fund, specifically for entry-level hospitality employees across all Pierce Resort properties. Chris's team was asked, "Is this a standard term?" The answer came back, "It is odd as now." On the evening of the agreement signing, a private dinner at a small restaurant in Nashville's Germantown neighborhood. Good natural light, 6 people around one table, no chandeliers. Chris Hemsworth arrived in the same worn jeans and leather work boots he had been wearing the night the agreement nearly fell apart. Halfway through dinner, a face appeared that he recognized. Aaliyah Davidson, working the room for the restaurant's event service, stopped when she saw him. He stood up and shook her hand and introduced her to Gerald Pierce as the only person at the October Gala who had gotten the evening completely right. Gerald Pierce shook her hand. He looked at her for a moment the way a man looks at a thing that tells him something about himself. He didn't say anything beyond the introduction, but he nodded. It was the particular nod of someone filing something away with the intention of actually using it. Aaliyah did not know then, she learned it 3 weeks later, that her name had appeared in a 2-sentence note that Chris's assistant had filed with the Sovereign Nashville's director of hospitality development the morning after the gala. The note had mentioned a specific allergen labeling catch and a quality of composure under circumstances that would have rattled most senior staff. The note had been the beginning of a conversation that had led in its own unhurried way to a promotion she was still in the middle of figuring out how to fully accept. She thanked him. He told her not to thank him, that she had earned it herself. He said it the way people say things they actually believe rather than things they are offering. He sat back down, picked up the pen, and signed the agreement. There are certain rooms that tell you what a person is made of, and those rooms are never the ones with chandeliers. They are the rooms before the event begins, when the guest list doesn't matter yet and no one has told you what to think of who just walked in. The choice you make in those rooms, whether to see a person or see a category, is the choice that costs you nothing in the moment and everything later. Chris Hemsworth had been in a lot of rooms like that. He had learned, in places far from Nashville, that the people who saw him clearly in those rooms were always worth knowing. The ones who didn't, well, they had already told you exactly what you needed to know. Have you ever walked into a room and been completely misjudged because of how you were dressed? Leave a comment and tell us what happened. And if stories like this one, about quiet dignity and the cost of making assumptions, matter to you, subscribe and turn on notifications. There is another story coming soon, and I promise you won't want to miss it. This is a fictional dramatized story created for educational and inspirational purposes. All supporting characters, businesses, and events are fictional. Any resemblance to real persons other than Chris Hemsworth is coincidental. Narration is AI assisted.